The sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon as Eleanor shuffled into her favorite local coffee shop, the familiar jingle of the door's bell signaling her arrival. At 90 years old, she wasn't in a hurry, but she wasn't afraid of being late either. Life had taught her that sometimes, the best things came when you took it slow. Today, however, something was different. As Eleanor made her way to the counter, the chatter in the room suddenly shifted. The door swung open with a loud bang, and in stormed a group of bikers. Their leather jackets, loud engines, and careless laughter seemed out of place in the quiet, cozy cafe. They swaggered up to the counter, throwing glances at the older woman standing by the window. Eleanor kept her head down, clutching her cane in one hand while the other reached for her purse. But even with her head down, she felt their eyes on her. "Hey, look at this old lady," one of the bikers sneered. "You're not lost, are you, Grandma? Shouldn't you be at home knitting or something?" Laughter erupted from the group. Eleanor's heart sank, but she refused to let it show. She'd been through worse in her 90 years, and a few loudmouthed bikers weren't going to break her. But just as she was about to turn away, another biker, a larger man with a thick beard, bumped into her on purpose. "Watch where you're going, old lady," he growled, a smirk playing on his lips. Eleanor stumbled slightly, her cane tapping the floor sharply as she regained her balance. The room fell silent for a second before the group of bikers burst into raucous laughter again, the sound echoing through the small cafe. Something inside Eleanor snapped. She had been patient for far too long. "What's the matter, tough guy? You think just because I'm older, I'm some easy target?" Eleanor's voice, though soft, carried an edge. The group quieted for a moment, confused by her unexpected retort. The biker with the beard chuckled, stepping closer. "What? You think you can stand up to me? You're just a shriveled-up old vet. Shouldn't you be retired by now?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of her purse. She wanted to say something sharp, something to put them in their place. But instead, her mind flashed back to another time. A time when she had been much younger, when she had fought battles that mattered, fought wars that had tested her very soul. But those were different times, and this was just a cafe. "Maybe I've earned the right to sit in peace," she muttered, turning away from the group. Her hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was the rage bubbling beneath the surface, the quiet, seething rage that only the world's cruelest moments could awaken. As Eleanor settled into her corner, she realized this wasn't over. The bikers weren't just loud and rude. They were bullying her, mocking her, and something told her they wouldn't stop. They'd keep pushing until she broke, or until she fought back. But what could an old woman do? She had been bullied in her youth, but she'd learned long ago that you can't fight every battle. Some things were just too hard to win. Still, her military training had taught her something important. Never back down when you're being tested. With a sigh, Eleanor reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her thoughts raced, and then it hit her. She wasn't alone in this. She never had been. There were people in her life who would stand with her if she asked. "Maybe it's time to call in a favor," she whispered under her breath. Before she could second-guess herself, she dialed the number that had been burned into her memory for years. The phone rang twice, then a voice answered on the other end. "Colonel Walker," came the gravelly voice of her old friend, James. "What's going on, Eleanor?" Her heart raced, not with fear, but with a quiet, determined hope. Maybe this wouldn't be just another day where she took it quietly. Maybe this time, she could fight back. "James, I need your help," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "There's a group of bikers, and they're starting to push me around." The other end of the line was silent for a moment, but Eleanor knew that silence well. It was the same silence James had given her after their last mission, the kind of silence that preceded action. "I'll be there," he said. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of what was to come settling over her. She was no longer the young soldier, ready to fight in a foreign land. But tonight, it seemed, the fight was coming to her. "Thank you, James," she whispered. The phone call had barely ended when Eleanor found herself sitting quietly, her thoughts drifting far from the small coffee shop and the bikers who had made her feel small just hours earlier. Instead, her mind wandered back to a time long ago, to a period of her life that had shaped her into the woman she was today. Eleanor was just a teenager when she first decided to enlist. It was 1942, and the world was at war. She remembered the uncertainty in the air, the fear and the patriotism that pulsed through every corner of the country. When the war came knocking, no one was spared, not even young women like her. At 18, Eleanor was determined to serve, to do her part. Her father, a proud and stoic man, had been against it at first. "Women should be at home," he'd said, shaking his head as Eleanor tried to explain her desire. "What can you possibly do in a war?" But Eleanor wasn't about to let anyone decide her future for her. She joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, and quickly found herself stationed at an army base in the southern United States. Despite the harsh training and the sexist comments from some of the men in her unit, Eleanor proved herself. She learned quickly, worked harder than most, and earned the respect of those around her. But nothing could have prepared her for the day she had to say goodbye to her young husband, George. They had met just a year before, and their whirlwind romance was the kind of thing you read about in books, passionate, hopeful, and full of dreams. George had enlisted in the army too, and the two of them were proud to serve side by side. But the war had a cruel way of taking people you loved, without warning, without mercy. One letter changed everything. It came in the middle of the night, delivered by an officer in full uniform. Eleanor read the letter in disbelief, her heart dropping into her stomach. George had been killed in a skirmish overseas, just weeks before he was supposed to return home. That letter, delivered with such finality, marked the beginning of Eleanor's struggle to find peace. The woman who had once been filled with hope now had to navigate a world that seemed cruel and indifferent. She stayed in the service for another year after George's death, though she had nothing left to stay for. The military gave her purpose, even if that purpose felt hollow without him. It was during those long months that Eleanor's resolve was hardened, her strength tested time and time again. By the time she left the service, she was no longer the wide-eyed young woman who had entered. She was someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone who had learned that even in the darkest of times, you could find a way forward. But life didn't stop after the war. Eleanor came home to a quiet house, filled with memories of George and the life they never got to share. She married again, though it never felt the same. She had a son, David, who grew up to be a successful lawyer in another state. But despite the years that passed, the quiet grief lingered. It shaped her, molded her into someone who preferred solitude over company and silence over noise. Her husband, Tom, died in his sleep a decade ago, leaving her alone once more. And so, Eleanor had lived her life with a quiet dignity. She was content in her little house, surrounded by memories of better days. The loss of her loved ones had taught her that survival was more than just living day to day. It was about enduring, even when there was no one to lean on. She had no illusions that life was fair, but she had learned that there was always something to fight for, even if it was just your own peace. Eleanor looked around her modest living room, where photos of her military days, of George, and of her son lined the walls. Each frame held a piece of her story, of the battles she had fought, both on foreign soil and within the confines of her own heart. Her mind returned to the bikers, a group of strangers, rude and brash, but they had made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, small, weak, insignificant. She could still hear the echoes of their laughter, their mocking tones. They were bullies, just like the ones she'd encountered in her youth. But this time, Eleanor wasn't going to stay quiet. She wasn't going to let them win. The phone call had been the first step in reclaiming what was hers. She would no longer sit idly by and let anyone walk all over her, no matter how big or loud they were. She had faced worse than this. She had survived the worst, and now she was ready to fight back. Her fingers reached for the photo of George that sat on the mantelpiece, and for a brief moment, her eyes softened. If only he could be here to see her now, strong, defiant, and ready to take on whatever the world threw her way. With renewed determination, Eleanor walked over to the phone once more, dialing the number she had called earlier. She needed to speak to James again, to make sure everything was in place. As she waited for the line to connect, she looked out the window, her gaze settling on the street outside. The world was quiet for now, but she knew that wouldn't last. Something was coming, and Eleanor was ready. The next morning, the same group of bikers returned to the cafe. Eleanor had hoped they might have forgotten about her, but deep down, she knew better. The memory of their mocking laughter would linger, and it would only be a matter of time before they came back for more. Sure enough, just as she was settling into her usual corner with a fresh cup of coffee, the door swung open, and the bikers strutted in. Eleanor wasn't surprised to see them. In fact, she had been half expecting it. But what caught her off guard was how different the group looked now. Dale, the one who had been most vocal the day before, swaggered in first, his leather jacket creaking as he made his way to the counter. He had a cocky grin plastered across his face, as if he thought the world owed him something. He caught Eleanor's gaze for a split second, then looked away dismissively. But this time, Eleanor wasn't going to back down. "Isn't it a little early for this lot?" she called out, her voice steady but laced with a challenge. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to catch their attention. Dale turned toward her, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. Well, look who's got something to say," he sneered, walking over to her table with a couple of his buddies trailing behind. "You still here, old lady? Thought you'd have enough by now." Eleanor didn't flinch. She sipped her coffee and met his gaze, unwavering. Her eyes had seen far worse than a gang of bikers throwing petty insults. But there was something in her chest, something new, something that felt like fire, that told her she wasn't going to let them push her around anymore. "People like you, Dale," she said, each word slow and deliberate, "think they can scare others with loud mouths and leather jackets. But I've faced real fear. I've seen real monsters. So forgive me if I'm not impressed by your little act." Dale's face reddened. His buddies laughed, but the laughter was awkward, as if they didn't quite know how to react to the old woman's sharp words. "Real monsters, huh?" Dale muttered, clearly looking for something to say that would put her back in her place. But he couldn't find it. Instead, he gestured at the biker sitting next to him, who cracked his knuckles menacingly. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, slowly putting her cup down. "You think you scare me?" she asked softly. "Trust me, I've seen worse. You've got nothing on what I've been through." The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire cafe had stopped breathing. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none of them dared to intervene. Eleanor wasn't sure if they were afraid of the bikers or just unsure about her. "I don't think you understand, lady," the biker with the knuckles cracked, his voice low and threatening. "We're not here to play games. You need to get it through your head that you're not in charge here." Eleanor's eyes flickered with a brief, controlled anger. She stood up slowly, drawing herself to her full height, her frail frame somehow feeling more imposing now. "Oh, I understand perfectly well," she said, her voice still calm. "But I think you're the ones who don't understand. You're so used to pushing people around that you forget. Some people don't break. Some people stand tall, no matter how hard you push." For a split second, she saw something flicker in Dale's eyes. It was the briefest moment, but it was enough to make her wonder if he was starting to second-guess this whole charade. But before she could say anything else, a voice boomed from across the room. "Hey!" A man with a thick voice and a military-style haircut stepped into the cafe, looking directly at the bikers. "Is there a problem here?" The bikers froze, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any man who had stepped in. It was James, the man she had called for help. She hadn't expected him to arrive so soon, but here he was, his eyes steely with the kind of resolve that only someone with his experience could have. "Everything's fine," Dale said with an uneasy laugh, though it didn't sound convincing. He looked back at his gang, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they were considering leaving. But then, as if to save face, he turned to James with a mock sneer. "No problem, just teaching this lady some manners." James stepped forward, his posture confident and calm. "You're not teaching anyone anything, Dale. I think you've overstayed your welcome." There was no doubt in the room now. The bikers were outmatched. The atmosphere was charged with the knowledge that they had picked the wrong fight, and they knew it. Dale's cocky grin faltered, but he wasn't ready to give up completely. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, glaring at Eleanor. He nodded to his gang, and they turned, their heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor as they made their way out of the cafe. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She felt the adrenaline surge through her veins, the victory sweet but fleeting. The bikers may have left, but the fear and doubt that had been creeping inside her chest hadn't completely disappeared. James stood beside her, his face a mixture of concern and pride. "You did well," he said quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't do it for the applause. I did it because I'm tired of being afraid." The sound of the door closing behind the bikers echoed through the cafe, and Eleanor realized, in that moment, that this was only the beginning. The bikers would come back. They always did. But she had just taken the first step in showing them that she wasn't someone to be pushed around. And this time, she wouldn't fight alone. After the bikers left, the cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The chatter resumed, and the quiet hum of the espresso machine filled the air. Eleanor sat back down, her hands still slightly trembling from the confrontation. Her coffee had gone cold, but it didn't matter. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. James lingered for a moment before taking a seat across from her, his presence still commanding the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of quiet authority that only someone with years of military service could pull off. Despite the calm look on his face, Eleanor could sense that he was just as aware as she was of the looming storm. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. She nodded, but there was something in her gaze that betrayed her calm exterior. "I'm fine. But this isn't over, James. Not by a long shot." James' eyes flickered with understanding. He'd known Eleanor for years, ever since their time in the service. He had seen her in the worst of circumstances, and he knew that when she said something wasn't over, she meant it. She wasn't the type to back down. "I figured as much," he said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But don't worry. We'll make sure they don't bother you again." Eleanor looked out the window, watching the world go by. The street was peaceful now, but the tension still hung in the air, thick and palpable. She knew the bikers would return. They always did. And next time, they would be angrier, more determined to break her. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I've fought battles before, James. But this is different. These men, they're bullies, and I don't know how to fight them." James leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "The thing about bullies is that they're only as strong as you let them be. They thrive on fear. But you, Eleanor, you're not afraid of them." "Not really." Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at James. She had known him for decades, but it was moments like this that reminded her of the bond they shared. James had been through his own share of hell, and despite the years that had passed, the connection between them was unshakable. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't want to be alone in this fight. I've fought wars, James, but I'm not sure I can handle this kind of battle on my own." James smiled, a reassuring smile that spoke volumes. "You don't have to fight alone, Eleanor. You've got me, and I know a few others who'll stand by you too. You've got a whole army of people who care about you, and we won't let you face this alone." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. She had spent so many years fighting battles on her own, convinced that she couldn't rely on anyone. But now, she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let others help her. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to feel the weight of her years and the strength of the people around her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. "Thank you, James," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James nodded, his expression steady. "You've got this, Eleanor, and I'll be here every step of the way." The conversation lulled into a comfortable silence, but neither of them was under any illusion that the storm had passed. The bikers would be back, that much was certain, but Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. She had a plan, and this time, she wasn't going to stand idly by. The bikers had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated her, and that was a mistake they would soon regret. As James stood to leave, he gave her a final, reassuring glance. "I'll keep an eye out," he said. Don't worry. We've got your back. Eleanor watched him leave, a sense of determination settling in her bones. The war was far from over. But this time, it wasn't just her fight. She had an army at her back, and together, they would show the world that Eleanor Dawson was not someone to be messed with. Days passed, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the calm before the storm. Every time she left her house, she noticed the small changes. The way people looked at her, the cautious glances, the whispers behind closed doors. The news of her confrontation with the bikers had spread throughout the town, and while some people were supportive, others remained skeptical, unsure of where to place their loyalties. But Eleanor wasn't thinking about those people. She was thinking about the bikers. They hadn't come back, but she knew they would. The adrenaline rush from the previous encounter had faded, and in its place was a gnawing anxiety. She was no longer just a quiet widow living her life in peace. She was a target. The phone rang, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She was expecting a call from James, but it was a different voice that answered the line. "Eleanor," the voice said, rough and gravelly, "this is Dale. You know, the guy you insulted the other day." Eleanor stood frozen for a moment. Her grip tightened around the receiver, but her voice remained steady. "What do you want, Dale?" "I think we need to talk," he said, his tone far more serious than the cocky bravado he had worn the last time they spoke. "Meet me at the old warehouse on Oak Street. Alone. If you don't show, we'll make our own arrangements." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. She knew Oak Street. It was one of the quieter areas of town, an industrial district where the decaying remains of old warehouses stood like silent sentinels. It wasn't the kind of place you went unless you had to, and the fact that Dale had chosen this location meant he was serious. For a split second, Eleanor hesitated. But then she thought of everything she had survived. The wars, the loss, the years of solitude. She had faced bigger challenges than this, and now she wasn't about to back down. "I'll be there," she said, her voice colder than it had ever been. The line went dead, and Eleanor set the receiver down slowly. She didn't need to tell James. He would know soon enough. She wasn't about to let fear control her. She had lived a lifetime of fear, and it had never won. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her resolve steady. The town's small streets blurred past her as she drove toward the warehouse. She couldn't help but notice how quiet everything felt. Even the wind had stilled, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to unfold. As she neared the warehouse, she spotted the familiar rumble of motorcycles parked in front. Dale and his gang were already here, waiting. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, but she didn't flinch. She parked her car and stepped out, her boots hitting the pavement with an almost rhythmic certainty. The warehouse loomed before her like a giant metal beast, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. She walked toward the entrance, her steps slow but purposeful, as the bikers began to gather around her. Dale was standing near the door, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing when he saw her approach. "So, the old lady's got guts after all," he said with a sneer. Eleanor didn't respond. She just stood there, looking him square in the eyes. The other bikers laughed, but this time, there was something different in the air. It was no longer just about intimidation. It was about proving a point. "You made a big mistake," Dale said, taking a step toward her. "You should have just stayed out of our way. Now, you've brought this on yourself." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that even Dale could sense. "You've been making mistakes ever since you set foot in this town. But this isn't about you. This is about me. And I'm not going to let you push me around anymore." There was a tense silence. For a moment, Dale didn't say anything. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he looked her over, sizing her up. "You really think you're going to stop us?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. But before Eleanor could answer, a new voice cut through the tension, loud and firm. "You're not going to do anything to her." The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the warehouse in the shadows was none other than James. But he wasn't alone. A handful of other men and women stood with him, all dressed in the same military-style clothing. They weren't just bystanders. They were veterans, just like Eleanor. People who had seen their fair share of battles and had the scars to prove it. James, what the hell is this? Dale spat, clearly caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the group. It's called backup, James replied, his voice calm but commanding. You've had your fun, but it's over now. You leave Eleanor alone, or you'll have to deal with all of us. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering as they realized they were outnumbered. For the first time, Eleanor saw fear flicker in Dale's eyes. We don't want trouble, one of the bikers muttered, shifting nervously on his feet. We're just here to send a message. Well, your message has been received, James said, stepping forward. But you've made the mistake of thinking you could bully someone who's been through hell and back. You're not going to win this fight. Eleanor took a step forward, her voice quiet but steady. It's over, Dale. You can go now. But next time you think about picking on someone, remember this. You might just find yourself up against people who've fought for far more than just their pride. Dale opened his mouth as if to say something, but then, with a sharp grunt, he motioned to his gang. They turned and left, their motorcycles roaring to life as they sped away, disappearing into the night. The tension in the air lifted, and for a long moment, Eleanor and James stood there, the cool night air wrapping around them. Thank you, Eleanor said softly, her eyes meeting James's. You don't have to thank me, he replied with a gentle smile. We've got your back always. As the sounds of the motorcycles faded, Eleanor felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight after all. The silence that followed the bikers' retreat felt surreal. Eleanor stood in the middle of the old warehouse parking lot, the faint scent of exhaust fumes lingering in the air. Her heart was still racing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't out of fear. It was adrenaline. It was the thrill of standing up for herself, of reclaiming something she thought she had lost. James was standing beside her, his presence unwavering. The others, the group of veterans who had come to her side, were now dispersing, nodding their heads as they filed into their own vehicles. You did good, Eleanor, one of them, a tall man with a gruff voice named Rick, said as he passed by. His eyes met hers with respect, and though he didn't say anything more, it was clear that he saw her not as a vulnerable old woman but as a fighter. Eleanor smiled faintly, grateful for the support, but there was still a weight on her chest. The bikers had left, but she knew that this wasn't the end. This battle was won, but the war, if it could even be called that, was still ongoing. James turned to her, his face softening as he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. You okay? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Eleanor nodded, though she knew the peace she felt now wouldn't last. I will be. I never expected to be in this position, you know? It's strange. I fought in wars, James. But this is different. It's personal, and it's just getting started. James' expression hardened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, an unspoken promise passing between them. I'll be here, Eleanor. I won't let them hurt you. Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked up at him. She had always been independent, but over the past few days, something had shifted. She had come to understand something profound. She didn't have to face everything alone. Not anymore. I know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I'm beginning to realize something. I've spent so many years thinking I had to protect myself from everything. From loss, from grief, from fear. But now, I see that maybe I've been wrong. James raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Eleanor took a deep breath, letting the night air settle in her lungs. I've spent so long pushing people away. I didn't want anyone to see how fragile I was, or how much I needed them. But the truth is, I do need people. We all do. And you've reminded me of that. James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. You're stronger than you think, Eleanor. I'm just glad you're letting people in again. You don't have to fight alone. For a moment, they stood in quiet understanding, the weight of the past few days sinking in. Eleanor wasn't just fighting to protect her home, her peace. She was fighting for herself, for the right to live without fear, for the right to choose who she let into her life, and for the strength to stand tall no matter who tried to knock her down. The world had tried to break her, over and over again. But somehow, she was still here, still fighting. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." James squeezed her shoulder gently. "You don't need to thank me. But if you ever need anything, anything at all, I'm just a call away." Eleanor smiled, a true smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I think I'm finally ready to fight this battle. And I know I'm not alone." As they walked back to their cars, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. The bikers might return. They might test her resolve again. But this time, she knew she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for a new beginning, for the chance to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. She had already won the most important battle of all, the battle for her own strength. And with that, she turned the key in the ignition, ready to face whatever came next. Because Eleanor Dawson wasn't just a woman who survived. She was a woman who thrived. The days following the standoff at the warehouse were quieter than Eleanor had expected. There were no more bikers lingering outside her home, no more threats from Dale or his gang. For a while, the tension that had been so thick in the air seemed to dissipate, and the town returned to its normal rhythm. People were cautious around Eleanor, but they had a newfound respect for her. Whispers of the old woman who stood up to the bikers spread, and she became something of an unexpected local hero. But Eleanor knew better than to think the storm was over. Silence, she had learned, could be the most dangerous thing of all. It was one crisp morning when the first sign that trouble was far from finished showed itself. Eleanor had been up early, as she always did, preparing her small home for the day. She was making her usual pot of coffee when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The number was unfamiliar, but she picked it up anyway. "Hello?" she answered, her voice steady, but a hint of wariness creeping in. The voice on the other end was calm but clipped, cold. "Eleanor Dawson, I take it?" Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer her question. Instead, it spoke in a matter-of-fact tone. "We've been watching you. You think the bikers left, but they're not gone. You've made an enemy of the wrong people." Eleanor's mind raced. She was used to confrontation, used to being on edge, but this felt different. The calmness of the voice, the lack of anger, the control, sent a chill through her. It was almost as if they weren't concerned with scaring her. They were just making a statement. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice firm, "but you're wasting your time. You won't get what you want from me." There was a long pause on the other end. Eleanor could hear muffled voices in the background, as if a group of people were talking. She felt a knot form in her stomach. "Oh, we're not interested in taking anything from you," the voice replied. "We just want you to know that there's always a price to pay for crossing the line." Before Eleanor could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen, her breath shallow. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering against the counter as she staggered back. Her mind raced, trying to process the conversation. She had a sinking feeling in her gut. Whoever this was, they weren't just part of Dale's gang. This was something bigger, something more calculated. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her front doorbell ringing. She jumped, startled. For a brief second, Eleanor considered ignoring it, pretending she wasn't home. But she had already lived through enough to know that avoidance never solved anything. She steadied her breath and walked to the door. When she opened it, she found a small package resting on the doorstep. No note, no indication of who it was from. Just the package, plain and simple. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she leaned down to pick it up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it over. It was light, as if whatever was inside was delicate. Her instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, but she ignored them. Inside the package was a single, folded piece of paper. Eleanor carefully unfolded it, reading the short message written in neat, precise handwriting. "We always find a way. You can't hide from us forever." Her stomach churned. It was the same chilling tone from the phone call. Whoever these people were, they were letting her know they had the power to track her, to find her, no matter where she went. They weren't done yet. Eleanor stood there for a moment, staring at the message. Her mind swirled with questions. Who were these people? What did they want from her? And why had they chosen now to come after her? She couldn't stay in the dark. She had to act. James was the first person she thought of. If anyone knew how to handle threats like this, it was him. She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed his number, her fingers moving quickly as her anxiety began to spike. The phone rang 3 times before James picked up. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice steady but concerned. "What's going on?" "I need your help," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I just got a message. It's not over. They've sent someone to watch me." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before James spoke again. His voice clipped. "Don't move. I'm coming to you." Eleanor knew what that meant. James wasn't the kind of man to just talk things through. When there was a threat, he acted. And that gave her some comfort, but also a lingering worry. She wasn't sure how much worse this could get, but something told her that this was just the beginning of a much bigger mess. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It wasn't yet noon, but she already felt like she'd lived through an entire day's worth of chaos. There was a feeling of unease in her chest, a constant reminder that danger was still very real, and it was only a matter of time before it reached her door again. But Eleanor wasn't about to let fear control her. She had survived worse than this, and she'd find a way to survive whatever came next. She took one last look at the note in her hand, and then, with resolve, she crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash. She wouldn't let these shadowy figures think they could intimidate her. If they wanted to play games, she was ready to play too. Eleanor sat in her kitchen, her mind racing. The note had been clear. She wasn't going to be left alone. The message, though brief, was loaded with a quiet, menacing confidence that unsettled her more than anything Dale and his gang had ever done. There was something deeper at play here, a force far more dangerous, far more organized than she had originally thought. As soon as she hung up with James, her thoughts turned to all the possibilities. The bikers had been bad enough, but this new threat felt colder. They weren't just bullying her. They were playing a game where she was the target, and they were moving the pieces around without her knowing. It was unsettling. The doorbell rang again, snapping her out of her thoughts. This time, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She knew who it was. James had said he'd be over quickly, and he didn't waste time. She opened the door to find him standing there, a grim look on his face. "Eleanor," he greeted her with a nod, his eyes scanning the area behind her before meeting her gaze. "You all right?" She didn't need to say anything. The worry in her eyes was enough of an answer. "I'm as all right as I can be." James stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze flicking over the house, making sure everything was in order. He didn't look like he was expecting an immediate attack, but the tension in his body told her that something had shifted. "We need to talk," he said quietly, lowering his voice as if someone might be listening. Eleanor nodded, leading him to the kitchen where she had been sitting. She'd already gotten rid of the note, but the memory of the cold, deliberate message was still fresh in her mind. She pulled out a chair and motioned for James to sit down. "Someone's been watching me," Eleanor said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of unease. "I don't know who they are, but they're not just bikers. These people know things about me, things I haven't told anyone." James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in focus. "I know. I've been thinking about that. It doesn't add up. The bikers, they were bad. But now, we're dealing with something different." "Different how?" Eleanor asked, her throat tightening. James looked around the room as if weighing his words carefully before speaking. "These people, whoever they are, they're organized. They're not just random thugs trying to make a quick buck or assert dominance. They're a part of something bigger, and they're making it personal with you." Eleanor swallowed hard. "But why me? What could I possibly have done to deserve this?" James shook his head. "It's not about you personally. It's about what you represent. You're a symbol of someone who's been through hell and back. And not only that, you stood up for yourself. You made a statement. And now, they're testing you." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she processed his words. She had lived through wars, dealt with grief, and survived more than most could ever imagine. But she had never expected to be dragged into something like this at her age. "They won't stop until they break you," James continued, his voice steady. "But we're not going to let them do that." Eleanor exhaled slowly, feeling a calmness spread through her at the reassurance. She had been alone for so long, but James wasn't just some neighbor. He was someone who understood what it meant to fight for what mattered, someone who didn't give up easily. "What do we do now?" she asked, the words feeling foreign coming from her mouth. "We go on the offensive," James said with a quiet intensity. "We need to find out who these people are, where they're coming from, and what they want. I'll gather some intel, talk to people who might know something. In the meantime, I want you to stay alert. Stay sharp." Eleanor felt a flicker of fear at the thought of more confrontation, but she quickly shoved it aside. This wasn't the time for fear. This was the time to fight back. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm. "I've spent my life running from things, but not anymore. If they want me, they'll have to come for me, and they'll have to deal with me first." James nodded, his gaze steady. "That's what I like to hear." They spent the next hour going over every detail they could think of. James asked questions about anyone who might have held a grudge against her, anyone who could have been involved in the biker's business. But Eleanor couldn't think of anyone who had the kind of reach these mysterious figures seemed to have. She was more concerned about how they knew so much about her, more than she was comfortable with, but it was clear that James was determined. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. As the sun began to set, the air outside growing cold, Eleanor felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders. She had survived battles, faced loss, and walked through darkness alone. But this felt different. She couldn't do this by herself. "I'll check in later," James said as he stood up to leave, his eyes locking onto hers with a promise. "Don't open the door for anyone, and don't trust anything that doesn't seem right." "I won't," Eleanor replied, standing to see him out. "I'm not afraid. I'm just cautious." James smiled faintly. "That's exactly what you need to be." As he left, Eleanor closed the door behind him and locked it, her gaze drifting to the darkening sky outside. The sense of impending danger lingered in the back of her mind, but she wasn't going to let it paralyze her. She'd faced fear head-on before, and she would do it again. She wasn't alone. She had people who had her back, and she was going to make sure those people knew everything she did. The game was far from over, but Eleanor was no longer just a player. She was in control. The next few days passed in a tense haze. Eleanor kept to her routine, moving through her home with a quiet, almost deliberate purpose. She didn't go out much, only stepping outside when she absolutely had to. It was hard to shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every move she made was being tracked. It wasn't just paranoia, it was instinct. Years of surviving had taught her to listen to that gut feeling, and it was screaming at her that the storm was still coming. James kept in contact regularly, checking in on her. He had made some calls, talked to a few contacts who might have information about the people threatening her, but so far, there had been nothing concrete. He had his suspicions, but nothing he could confirm. It was as if these people didn't exist in any official records. They were a shadow, an elusive force that had slipped through the cracks. Eleanor had become more attuned to her surroundings, noticing little things that seemed off. A car parked across the street at odd hours. A shadowy figure walking past her house more than once. It could have been anyone, but in her gut, she knew these were no coincidences. It was the evening of the fourth day after the phone call when the first real sign that the shadows had begun to close in on her appeared. Eleanor had just finished her dinner, a quiet affair of soup and bread, when she heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. She stiffened, her heart racing as she glanced out the window. The car was unfamiliar, a dark SUV with tinted windows. It slowed as it passed her house and then, to her shock, it stopped right in front of her driveway. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't James, she realized. He would have called first. And it wasn't a neighbor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She moved quietly to the door and peered through the peephole. The shadows obscured the driver's face, but she could see the silhouette of someone standing by the car. A tall figure, broad shoulders. Eleanor's fingers instinctively reached for the phone on the kitchen counter. She dialed James' number quickly, trying to stay calm, but the ringing on the other end only made her nerves worse. The figure by the car seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard a knock on her door. She couldn't just ignore it. not with the threat looming. But she also knew that whoever was on the other side wasn't someone she could trust. They weren't here to deliver flowers. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor cautiously moved to the door, her eyes never leaving the figure outside. She grabbed the nearest object within reach, a heavy wooden candlestick, and held it in her hand like a weapon. Her pulse raced as she hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. The moment the door creaked open, the figure outside stepped forward, blocking most of the light from the porch. Eleanor's hand tightened around the candlestick, ready to strike if necessary. "You're Eleanor Dawson, right?" The voice was low, unassuming, but there was a hard edge to it, like the person on the other side was used to getting what they wanted. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She could hear the faint hum of the engine still running in the background. Whoever this person was, they weren't here to chat. "I am," she replied, her voice steady but sharp, trying to keep the fear out of it. The figure stepped closer, just enough that Eleanor could see more clearly now. He was wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. It was impossible to read his expression, but his body language screamed intimidation. "You've been warned before," the man said, his voice almost a whisper now. "But you don't seem to be getting the message." Eleanor held her ground. "I don't scare easily." The man chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "You should, because this is just the beginning." Before she could react, he stepped back quickly and turned toward the car. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, the SUV sped off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on her chest. They were making their move. She could feel it. They were closing in. She pulled the door shut, locking it again with trembling hands. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't safe. Not anymore. Minutes passed before her phone finally rang. It was James. "Eleanor," he said, his voice urgent. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she lied, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. "But they're here. They came to my door." James was silent for a moment, as if weighing the seriousness of what she'd said. "Did they threaten you?" "They didn't have to say much." The message was clear. "They're not stopping." James cursed under his breath. "Stay inside, lock everything down. I'm coming over." "I don't think that's enough anymore," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but tense. "They know where I am, James. They know everything. I need to know more about who these people are. I'm not waiting for them to come back." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then James spoke. "I agree. Let me make some calls. We'll figure this out. But right now, you have to stay safe." Eleanor didn't argue. She wasn't going to take chances anymore. She'd let things go on for too long. The next steps were hers to take. "I'll be careful," she said, "but we're not playing by their rules anymore. This ends now." James' voice softened. "I'm with you, Eleanor. We'll figure this out." She hung up and looked around her house. The walls felt suddenly smaller, the shadows longer. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her next move. Not anymore. She was going to fight. But she needed to know her enemy first. The night stretched on, the ticking of the clock on the wall louder than usual, almost deafening in the quiet. Eleanor sat in her living room, the lights dimmed to their lowest setting, her thoughts racing faster than her ability to process them. The encounter at her door had left her shaken, but she was determined not to let it break her. This was no time to back down. She'd faced worse, much worse, and come out stronger. But this was different. This was calculated, deliberate. Whoever these people were, they were playing a dangerous game, and Eleanor had no intention of being their pawn. She grabbed her phone and dialed James again, unable to shake the feeling of helplessness that had crept in. He picked up after the first ring. "Eleanor," James greeted, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm on my way. I've got some information, but we need to act fast." Eleanor stood up, pacing the small space of her living room, her thoughts racing. "What have you found?" "There's something about these people. They're not just a random group of thugs," James explained, his voice growing more serious. "I've been digging around, and I found a connection to a company, a security firm that specializes in high-level surveillance and private investigations. It's based out of a city about 2 hours away from here. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Surveillance? Private investigations? Why would they be involved with me? James sighed, a deep, frustrated breath. I don't know yet, but this isn't just some street gang trying to intimidate you. This is bigger. They've been hired to do something specific, but what exactly, I haven't figured out yet. Eleanor's fingers clenched into fists, frustration building inside her. She had fought too many battles in her life to be intimidated by some hired goons. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about her personally. It was about something else, something that had drawn the attention of people far more dangerous than she was used to dealing with. Do you think they're watching me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. I think they've been watching you for a while, James replied, his tone grim. But they're not just observing anymore. They're pushing you to see how you'll react. It's part of their plan. Eleanor stopped pacing, her back straightening. Well, if they want a reaction, they've got one. They've underestimated me. There was a pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again, his voice low. Eleanor, I need you to be careful. These people play for keeps. I don't know who's behind them, but they're not someone you want to mess with. Too late for that, she muttered under her breath. I've already made my move. James's voice softened. Listen to me. I'll get you the information I can. But right now, you need to stay put. Don't do anything reckless. Eleanor let out a sharp breath, frustration bubbling to the surface. You think I'm just going to sit here and wait for them to make their next move? No, James. I can't. I've been sitting by for too long. I'm not letting this go. She could hear the hesitation in his voice. Eleanor, you're not alone in this. But you have to trust me. We need to figure out who they are first, or we risk making things worse. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she forced herself to stay calm. Fine, but I'm not sitting idly by. I'll follow your lead, but I'll take matters into my own hands if necessary. All right, James said with a sigh. I'll be there soon. Just hang tight. Eleanor ended the call and set the phone down on the table. She glanced at the front door, the lock on it feeling more like a flimsy piece of paper than a solid barrier. She wasn't sure what was worse, the uncertainty of who these people were or the realization that they were always one step ahead. She moved to the window and peered out into the night, her eyes scanning the quiet street. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, but there was no sign of anyone lurking outside. No cars, no figures watching from the corners. Yet the fear lingered, thick in the air. Her thoughts drifted back to the information James had uncovered, a security firm tied to private investigations. It made sense in a twisted way. They weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were building a profile. They were setting up for something bigger, and she was the focal point. Eleanor wasn't sure if she was prepared for whatever was coming next, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let them control the narrative. They could follow her, threaten her, but they would never break her. The feeling of powerlessness gnawed at her, but she pushed it away. She had to be smarter, more strategic. If she wanted to stop this, she needed to get ahead of the game. And that meant finding out more about these people, understanding their motivations, and uncovering whatever secrets they were hiding. The doorbell rang again, snapping her from her thoughts. She didn't have to check the peephole to know it was James. He'd promised he'd be there soon, and he wasn't one to break his word. She opened the door to find him standing there, his expression intense, eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped inside, his gaze quickly scanning the room. I've got more, James said, his voice low and filled with urgency. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. What did you find? James pulled out a piece of paper, handing it to her. It was a printout of a website, the name of the security firm. But beneath that, there was an address. The same city James had mentioned, but now with a contact name attached. Eleanor studied the paper, her heart pounding. What is this? This, James said, is where we're going next. Eleanor stood in the dim light of her hallway, the printout still clutched in her hands. James was pacing back and forth in front of her, eyes fixed on the paper with an intensity that matched the growing tension in the room. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them both. She turned the paper over again, scanning the address and the name of the security firm that seemed to be at the center of all this. She couldn't help but feel a pit in her stomach as she read the words again. It wasn't just a company. It was a well-known firm with a reputation for being involved in high-risk, covert operations. They had connections to powerful people, which made sense now. The bikers, the surveillance, the threats, it was all connected. But to what? How sure are you about this? Eleanor finally asked, her voice steady, but her mind was whirling. James stopped pacing and met her gaze. I'm sure enough. I've dug through public records, made some calls to people who know the company. It's legit, but they operate under the radar. They specialize in corporate security, high-stakes investigations, and keeping things quiet. Whatever's going on, it's not something they want getting out. Eleanor's grip tightened around the paper. So they've been hired for a job. But why me? What could I possibly have to do with all this? James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, but it's clear you're part of something bigger, something that's got them worried. They're trying to scare you, make you back down, but they're underestimating you. That's the one thing we've got going for us. Eleanor nodded slowly, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The more she learned, the less it made sense. It was almost as if she were a pawn in some larger game. A game that she hadn't asked to play, but one that she couldn't avoid anymore. We need to go to that address, Eleanor said, her voice determined. We need to see what's really going on. Maybe this will give us some answers. James looked at her, concern flashing in his eyes. Eleanor, are you sure about this? We're going into the lion's den. It's risky. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. She looked at him, her eyes hardening. We've been on the defensive long enough. I'm not waiting for them to come to me. I'm going to find out what they want and why they're targeting me. And I'm going to end this now. James seemed to consider this for a moment, his jaw tightening as if he were weighing the risk. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we do this my way. We don't rush in blind. We stick to the plan and stay focused. Got it? Eleanor nodded firmly. Got it. The drive to the city felt like it took forever. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the landscape blurred by. Her mind was racing with questions she didn't have answers to. The deeper they dug into this mystery, the darker and more dangerous it became. It wasn't just a matter of the bikers anymore. There was a whole network behind them, pulling the strings, and Eleanor was right in the middle of it. James kept the car moving at a steady pace, his eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. He was on high alert, his hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Eleanor couldn't blame him. This was risky, and they both knew it. As they entered the city, the skyline loomed ahead, the bright lights of the downtown area casting long shadows on the streets below. James slowed down as they approached the address on the paper, a nondescript building tucked between two larger, more impressive structures. The building looked almost abandoned, the windows dark and the entrance unremarkable. But something about it sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Stay close, James said, his voice low. We're not sure who's here, or what's going on inside. If anything feels off, we leave, got it? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She was already out of the car, her feet hitting the pavement with purpose. She wasn't going to back down now. She had come too far. She followed James into the building, her senses on high alert. The lobby was sparse, the air stale and heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. A lone security guard sat behind a desk, his eyes focused on a small television screen. He barely glanced up as they walked past, as though he didn't care who was entering the building. James led her down a narrow hallway to an elevator, his pace quickening as they approached. He pressed the button, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft ding. They stepped inside, the tension thick between them. 6th floor, James muttered, pressing the button for the top floor. If anyone notices us, we're out of here. We don't have time for confrontation. The elevator hummed as it ascended, the soft sound of the gears turning almost soothing in the otherwise tense atmosphere. Eleanor's heart was pounding in her chest, each floor passing slower than the last. She was close. They were close. Whatever answers they were going to find, they were right on the other side of those doors. The elevator finally dinged, and the doors slid open. James stepped out first, his eyes scanning the hallway. The floor was eerily quiet, the hallway lit by low, flickering lights. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, they reached a door marked with a simple plaque that read, "Private Investigations." James glanced at Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "Ready?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Let's do this." James pushed the door open, and they stepped into the room. Inside, the room was darker than she expected. Dimly lit by a single desk lamp, the space was cluttered with papers, photographs, and files scattered across a long table. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and something metallic, and Eleanor felt a surge of unease wash over her. It was like stepping into a hive of secrets, each document and photograph another piece of the puzzle they had yet to solve. At the far end of the room, a man sat behind a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't look up as they entered. "Well, well," the man's voice broke the silence, smooth and cold. "I wasn't expecting company tonight." Eleanor's heart raced as she stepped into the room, her breath shallow and her pulse pounding in her ears. The man behind the desk didn't move, didn't acknowledge them immediately. He just sat there, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the dim light. There was something cold about him, a calmness that sent chills down her spine. James was the first to speak, his voice steady but edged with tension. "We're here for information. About your company. About the people you've been working with." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly raised his head, revealing a face that seemed both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. His features were sharp, his eyes dark and calculating. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who knew the game better than anyone else in the room. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. There was something about this man that unnerved her, something she couldn't place. "You think you're the first to come poking around?" The man finally spoke, his voice smooth but carrying a weight of warning. "People like you, they always show up when things get too messy. But I'll tell you now, you won't find what you're looking for." James took a step forward, his posture tense but resolute. "We don't need your threats. We need answers. Who are you working for? Who's pulling the strings behind all this?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "You're digging in the wrong place. You won't like what you find." Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Enough with the games. We know you're behind the intimidation. We know you've been watching me. You don't scare me. You won't control this anymore." The man's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't fear, but there was recognition, a flicker of something that told her he knew exactly who she was. "You think you're in control here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been playing right into their hands, Eleanor." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto hers with an unsettling intensity. "The ones who hired us? They've been watching you for a long time. You think this is about some bikers? No. This is about power. This is about something much bigger than you realize. You're just a small piece of the puzzle." Eleanor's mind raced. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed the threats were just about intimidation, some misguided attempt to scare her off. But now, with the man's words sinking in, she realized it was much more complex than that. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was part of something far larger, a game she had only just stumbled into. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with raw urgency. The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've been targeted, Eleanor. You've been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, your fate is tied to forces that are far beyond your control. They want you to play your part, to be their tool. But if you think you're just some innocent bystander, you're fooling yourself." The weight of his words hit Eleanor like a ton of bricks. She took a step back, suddenly feeling the gravity of everything she had walked into. This wasn't just about surviving threats or uncovering who was behind them. This was about something deeper, something insidious. And she was in the center of it, whether she liked it or not. James stood beside her, his presence a quiet anchor. He glanced at her briefly, then turned his focus back to the man. "Who are they? Who's behind all of this?" The man gave them a long, unreadable look, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice calm but heavy with finality. I can't tell you that, but I can tell you this. You're not prepared for what comes next. No one is. You can keep digging, keep fighting, but you're walking into a storm, and once it hits, there's no way out. The silence in the room was suffocating. Eleanor felt the weight of the man's words settle over her like a dark cloud, threatening to swallow everything she had built up until now. She thought about all the threats, all the close calls, the bikers, the phone calls, the strange encounters. She thought about the lives that had been touched by these mysterious forces and the fear that had seeped into her every step. But she wasn't going to let fear control her. Then we'll face the storm together, Eleanor said, her voice low but fierce, a fire burning in her chest. I'm not backing down. The man's eyes narrowed. You think you can take them on? You don't even know who you're dealing with. I don't need to know everything, she replied, her voice gaining strength. But I'll fight for what's right, for the truth, and for the people who can't fight for themselves. The man didn't reply immediately. He just studied her, as if weighing something inside her. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something closer to amusement. You've got guts. I'll give you that, he said. But let's see how long that lasts when you're in over your head. Eleanor didn't flinch. I've been in over my head before. I know how to swim. James glanced at her, his expression conflicted but impressed. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew one thing. Eleanor wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The man's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, and his smile faded. Time's running out, he said, his voice colder now. You'll find out soon enough what you're really up against. Before Eleanor could respond, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Get out. You've asked your questions, and I've given you your answers. But remember, you wanted this. Eleanor felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she kept it in check. She wasn't going to let him have the last word. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. She turned and walked out of the room, James following close behind her. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment, Eleanor just stood in the hallway, her heart pounding. Are you all right? James asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm fine, but I've got a feeling we're just getting started. Eleanor and James stood in the hallway, the door to the shadowy office closing behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet building. The adrenaline still buzzed through Eleanor's veins, but now there was something else too, a sense of unease. It was as if they had uncovered just a sliver of a much darker reality, and there was no turning back now. James glanced at her, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. You heard what he said. He's not wrong, Eleanor. This is bigger than we thought. Eleanor met his gaze, her face hardening. I know, but I'm not backing down. Not now, not after everything they've done to me. Her mind raced, processing the man's words, the cold warning that they were walking into a storm. She had fought too many battles to walk away from this one. Well, James said, trying to offer a bit of levity, at least we're facing this storm together. We'll figure it out. Eleanor gave him a tight smile, grateful for his support, but she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. The stakes had escalated, and she could feel the weight of what was at risk, not just for her, but for the people she cared about. As they walked down the dimly lit corridor to the elevator, the silence between them was heavy with the realization of how deep the rabbit hole went. This was no longer just about a few bikers trying to intimidate her or a shadowy security firm. This was something far more complex and dangerous, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took closer to the truth was a step deeper into a world they didn't fully understand. When they reached the car, James started the engine, the sound of the engine rumbling through the stillness of the night. Eleanor stared out the window as they drove back toward her house, the city lights flickering in the rearview mirror like fading stars. I'm scared, James, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who's behind all of this, and I don't know what they want from me. James didn't look at her, but his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Fear is a natural reaction. but it doesn't control you unless you let it. We'll figure this out together." Eleanor didn't say anything in response. Instead, she let his words settle in her mind as they drove through the darkened streets. There was no denying that she was afraid. Who wouldn't be? But the fear wasn't the enemy. It was the unknown, the uncertainty of what was lurking just around the corner. The realization that the path ahead was filled with more questions than answers. As they approached her house, Eleanor felt the familiar sense of discomfort she'd had ever since the threats began. The idea of being watched, of never truly being alone, was unnerving. She had been able to ignore it, brush it aside. But now that they were on the brink of something bigger, the reality of it weighed heavily on her. She stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the street as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. James followed her, staying close, ever watchful. "Do you think we're being followed?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with suspicion. James's eyes flicked to the surroundings, but his expression remained calm. "I don't know, but we're going to be more careful. We'll get through this." Eleanor nodded, though a part of her wasn't so sure. It felt like they were being pulled into something much darker, something with forces far beyond their control. She was a veteran, someone who had lived through things most people couldn't imagine, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. They reached the front door, and as Eleanor opened it, she was suddenly aware of how quiet everything seemed. Too quiet. No sounds from the street, no distant traffic. Just an eerie silence that settled in the air like a weight. "James," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I don't feel right. Something's off." James's hand was already on the door handle, ready to step inside. But at the same moment, there was a sharp noise from behind them, the distinct sound of a car engine turning off. They both froze, their instincts kicking in. Slowly, they turned to face the source of the sound. A dark SUV was parked a few yards down the street, just on the edge of the dimly lit area. The headlights were off, but the vehicle was running, its engine purring quietly in the stillness of the night. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "We're not alone." James stepped closer to her, his voice calm but with a hint of urgency. "Stay inside. I'll check it out." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "We do this together. I'm not hiding in there while you deal with whatever this is." They shared a brief, silent moment of understanding before James nodded. They didn't need to speak any further. They were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it head-on. Eleanor stepped forward, moving carefully toward the SUV. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her focus. If someone was watching her, if they had been trailing her, she wasn't going to let them control her movements. She'd seen enough to know that fear could only be conquered by facing it directly. As they approached the SUV, Eleanor's nerves were on edge. She half expected someone to jump out at them, but instead, the vehicle remained still, the engine running steadily. She motioned for James to stay close, her mind working through a dozen possibilities at once. When they reached the driver's side, the door suddenly swung open, and a tall figure stepped out. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man standing before her, the one from the shadowy office, the man who had warned her of the storm. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The man's voice was calm but full of menace. His eyes flickered with a knowing, almost amused glint. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the surge of panic building inside her. The man smiled, his expression dark. "I've already told you. This isn't something you walk away from. You're too deep now. But if you want to make it out in one piece, you're going to have to play by our rules." James moved slightly in front of Eleanor, his body tense. "And if she doesn't?" The man's smile widened, though his eyes never left Eleanor. "Then we all lose. But there's still time to choose your side." Eleanor stood tall, her fear melting into a determination she hadn't felt in years. She had been through too much to back down now, and no one, not even this man, would control her destiny. "Then I'll choose my side," she said, her voice unwavering. The man's smile faltered for a brief moment, but it quickly returned, colder than before. "So be it," he said, and with a sharp nod, he turned and climbed back into the SUV. The engine roared to life once more, and the vehicle slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. Eleanor watched as the SUV faded into the distance, her heart still racing. She could feel the storm on the horizon, but now she wasn't afraid of it. She had made her choice, and whatever came next, she would face it with strength, with courage, and with the unwavering knowledge that she was in control of her fate. The next few days passed in a blur. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and that feeling, that gnawing sensation at the back of her mind, was beginning to feel like more than just paranoia. Every time she left the house, her eyes darted to every passing car, every figure in the distance. It wasn't just the dark SUV anymore. It was everywhere. She couldn't ignore it any longer. James had been quiet, even more so than usual. He was always keeping an eye out, scanning their surroundings like a soldier preparing for battle. He wasn't saying it, but Eleanor knew he was just as concerned as she was. They were no longer playing a game of cat and mouse. This was real, and it was getting more dangerous by the hour. By the time the weekend rolled around, Eleanor had made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep living like this in a constant state of fear. She needed to find answers, and she needed to do it now. "James, I think it's time we go back to the place where it all started," she said one morning as they sat over coffee, the tension between them palpable. James looked up from his cup, his brow furrowing. "You don't mean that abandoned warehouse, do you?" Eleanor nodded. The place where everything had spiraled out of control, the place where she had first encountered the bikers and their connection to the shadows of the city. The warehouse was more than just a location to her now. It was the key to unlocking everything. "I don't think we have a choice," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "We need to go there and see if we can find anything that can lead us to the bigger picture, to the people pulling the strings." James hesitated, but only for a moment. "All right, we'll do it, but we need to be smart. We can't afford any mistakes." They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering supplies, and mapping out their route. There was no telling what they might find at the warehouse, or who might be waiting for them there. But one thing was certain. The longer they stayed in the dark, the more dangerous this whole thing would become. By nightfall, they were on the road. The streets were quieter now, the shadows stretching long in the dimming light. Eleanor's grip tightened on the seat as James navigated the familiar roads. The city seemed peaceful, almost serene, but that peace felt like an illusion. Beneath the surface, there was something much darker at play. As they approached the warehouse, Eleanor felt a chill creep up her spine. The place was just as she remembered. A hulking, abandoned structure, its windows boarded up, the metal door rusted from years of neglect. It was silent now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They were walking into the heart of the storm. James parked a little ways off, and they both stepped out of the car. The cold night air hit Eleanor's face, and she felt the weight of everything bearing down on her. But there was no turning back. They had come this far, and they were going to see it through. They crept up to the door, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. James motioned for Eleanor to stay close, his eyes scanning the area as they approached the door. He tried the handle, locked. Of course, but they had prepared for this. James pulled out a small set of tools from his bag, and within minutes, the door creaked open. Inside, the warehouse was just as dark and empty as before. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with remnants of forgotten things. Broken furniture, pieces of machinery, and trash piled in corners. Nothing here had changed in the years since she'd last been inside. "Let's stick together," James murmured, his voice low. They moved cautiously through the space, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Eleanor's mind raced as they walked, every sound amplified in the stillness. She had the feeling they weren't alone, that someone, something, was waiting in the shadows. But there was no sign of anyone, at least, not yet. Then they reached the far end of the warehouse, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. There, hidden in the corner, was a door. It was old, but there was something about it that made her stop in her tracks. The door had been there all along, but she hadn't noticed it before. It was as if it had been hidden, disguised. James seemed to notice the same thing. He stepped forward, running his hand over the surface. This wasn't here last time, or if it was, it's been covered up. Eleanor felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever was behind this door, It was the key to everything. This was what they had been looking for. James reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Get down," James hissed, pulling her down behind a stack of crates. They both crouched low, holding their breath as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone, or something, was coming. Eleanor's mind raced. Who was it? Was it the bikers? Someone from the shadowy organization? Or worse, was it the man from the SUV? They waited, tense and silent, the darkness pressing in around them. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. Eleanor's hand tightened around the flashlight, her knuckles white. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, and then a figure appeared, moving slowly through the shadows. The light from Eleanor's flashlight flickered, catching just enough to reveal a familiar face. It was the man from the office, the one who had warned her of the storm. He smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice smooth but heavy with menace. Eleanor's heart dropped. There was no turning back now. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised. And now, she would have to face whatever came next, with everything she had. Eleanor's heart raced as the man's cold smile bore down on her, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the warehouse. She had been prepared for many things, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was about uncovering the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. And she couldn't back down now. "You've come a long way," the man said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something darker. "But you still don't understand the full picture, do you?" Eleanor's pulse quickened. She couldn't let him manipulate her, couldn't let him turn this into a game. "I understand enough," she said, her voice firm. "What do you want from me?" The man chuckled softly, as if amused by her question. "It's not what I want from you. It's what you're willing to do for yourself. You've been asking the wrong questions, Eleanor, but you're starting to get it. Finally." James shifted beside her, his body tense, every muscle on high alert. He was ready, but Eleanor knew this wasn't just a physical battle. This was a mental one too. The man stepped closer, his boots echoing on the concrete floor as he approached them. "You've been following breadcrumbs, thinking you're getting closer to the truth. But you're not. You've only scratched the surface." Eleanor's mind raced. What was he talking about? How did he know what she had been doing? It was clear now that this wasn't a random threat. This was someone who had been watching her every move, someone who knew exactly what she was after. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. "I mean that you're chasing ghosts. You're fighting a battle that's already been won. The real power isn't here. It's somewhere much deeper. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself completely consumed by it." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. She had a sinking feeling that he wasn't just talking about her situation. He was warning her. Or maybe trying to scare her into backing down. Either way, the words echoed in her mind. Consumed by it. What was this man trying to say? Before she could respond, a sudden noise interrupted the moment. It was a low hum at first, distant and soft. But as the seconds ticked by, the hum grew louder. It was coming from above. Eleanor looked up, and for the first time, she noticed something strange about the ceiling. There, tucked away in the darkness, was a hatch. It had been there all along, but she hadn't seen it until now. The man turned his head, his eyes flickering with something that resembled recognition. "So it begins," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned back to Eleanor. "I'll give you one last chance. Stop digging. Walk away from this, and you won't have to face the consequences." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What consequences?" she demanded, stepping forward. Her hands clenched into fists, her mind spinning. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in her head, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked toward the hatch in the ceiling, his eyes narrowing as if he were considering something. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can control what's happening here? You have no idea what you're up against." He took a deep breath, his expression softening just a fraction. But I'll give you a choice, Eleanor. You can keep fighting. You can keep chasing after a truth that's already been buried for a reason. Or you can walk away, leave this place, and pretend none of it ever happened. James stepped forward, his eyes locking with the man's. And if she doesn't walk away? The man's smile returned, a cruel twist of his lips. Then the storm will come for you both, and you won't survive it. Eleanor's mind was spinning. The words echoed in her mind. The storm will come. But what did that mean? What kind of threat was this man really making? Suddenly, the hum from above grew louder, almost deafening. The man's gaze snapped upward, his face twisting in anger. You shouldn't have come here, he spat, his voice dark with fury. This was never supposed to happen. Before Eleanor or James could react, the ceiling above them gave way. A section of the roof seemed to explode outward, and a figure descended from the shadows, a tall, menacing silhouette with glowing eyes. The hum intensified, now a deafening roar as the figure landed on the ground with a thud, a monstrous form that towered over them. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary man. This was something else. Get back, James shouted, pushing Eleanor behind him. But it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, lunged toward them, moving with terrifying speed. Eleanor barely had time to react before the creature reached them, its cold, metallic hand grabbing her by the wrist. She gasped as a surge of electricity shot through her body, paralyzing her in place. "James!" she screamed, her voice strained with pain. But James was already moving, pulling out a gun, firing at the creature with pinpoint accuracy. The shots didn't seem to faze it. It continued to hold Eleanor firmly in its grip, its glowing eyes fixed on her with unrelenting focus. "Let her go," James shouted, firing again. But the creature only tilted its head, as if considering him, before it tightened its grip on Eleanor's wrist. Eleanor's vision blurred as the electricity coursed through her veins, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now. She gathered every ounce of strength she had left, her free hand shooting out to grab a nearby piece of debris. She swung it at the creature's face, striking it with a satisfying crunch. The creature staggered back, releasing her for just a moment. That was all the time Eleanor needed. She stumbled back into James's arms, gasping for breath. "We need to get out of here," James said urgently, pulling her away from the creature. But Eleanor could feel it. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. As they ran toward the door, the hum from above intensified, filling the warehouse with a maddening roar. They couldn't escape this. Not yet. Not until they discovered who was behind the creature and what its true purpose was. The storm had arrived. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Eleanor has made it out of the warehouse, but the real fight has just begun. Will they survive the storm that's coming for them, or will they be consumed by it? The sound of their hurried footsteps echoed through the abandoned warehouse, but the noise that filled the air was something far more sinister. The hum from above, once distant and barely perceptible, now rumbled like thunder, vibrating through the very floor beneath them. Eleanor's mind raced, her pulse a staccato beat in her ears as she tried to focus on anything that might help them escape. James was beside her, his grip tight on her arm, pulling her toward the door. She could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced back toward the creature, which was recovering far too quickly from the blow she dealt it. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow, like twin orbs of malice, and every step it took sent a shiver down her spine. "Keep moving," James barked, his voice sharp with urgency. But there was something else in his voice, something that told Eleanor he wasn't just afraid of the creature. He was afraid of what was coming next. They reached the door, but Eleanor could hear the unmistakable sound of the creature's heavy footsteps behind them. It was gaining on them, and fast. James yanked at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" James cursed, pulling harder. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and for the first time, Eleanor saw him falter. Fear. She saw fear in his eyes. He had always been so composed, so sure of himself, but not now. This wasn't something he could control. Eleanor didn't have time to think. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room. There had to be another way out. Her breath was ragged, and her body was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion, but she pushed through it, scanning every inch of the warehouse, trying to find something that could save them. And then she saw it. A small window, high up near the ceiling, barely large enough to fit through. But it was their only option. "James, up there!" she shouted, pointing toward the window. He turned and saw it too. Without a word, he pulled her to her feet, his expression grim. "We have no choice." Together, they ran to the back of the warehouse, the creature's snarls and footsteps growing louder with every passing second. The noise was deafening, a relentless, growing force that made the walls seem like they were closing in on them. James boosted Eleanor up first, his hands pressing against her back to give her a better grip. She could feel the sweat on his palms, the desperation in his touch. But there was no time to waste. She scrambled toward the window, her hands scraping against the rough surface as she pulled herself up. "Come on, Eleanor," James urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Hurry." She finally reached the ledge and, with a deep breath, shoved herself through the window. She tumbled out onto the cold ground, the night air hitting her face in a sharp rush. She gasped, trying to catch her breath. But as she rolled onto her feet, she heard a loud crash from behind her. The creature had reached them. "James!" she cried, spinning around. James wasn't far behind. He had made it to the window but now seemed trapped, struggling against the creature's grasp. The shadowy figure towered over him, its glowing eyes filled with malevolent purpose. Eleanor's heart stopped as she watched the creature pull James closer, its cold, metallic grip locking around his wrist. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed a nearby metal pipe from the ground and sprinted back toward the creature. She swung it with every ounce of strength she had left, striking the creature's arm with a sickening crack. The creature recoiled for a moment, its grip loosening on James just enough for him to break free. James scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Eleanor didn't hesitate, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him with all her strength toward the alley behind the warehouse. But the creature was relentless. It wasn't done yet. "Go!" James shouted, his voice raw with urgency. He pushed her forward, forcing her to move faster. "Get to the car. I'll hold it off." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She couldn't leave him. Not like this. But James didn't give her a choice. With a final shove, he broke away, drawing the creature's attention toward him. Eleanor could see the determination in his eyes, the refusal to let this end like this. He was going to fight, and he was going to make sure she got away. "No, James!" she screamed, but he was already running toward the creature, grabbing anything he could find to defend himself. She didn't hesitate any longer. She ran toward the car, her legs aching with every step. She could hear the sounds of struggle behind her, the sickening thuds of the creature's strikes, the grunts of James fighting back. She had to make it to the car. She had to get him out of there. Finally, she reached the vehicle, fumbling with the keys as her hands trembled. She didn't stop to think. She just got in and started the engine. The car roared to life, and as the headlights illuminated the street, she caught a final glimpse of James. He was on the ground, struggling against the creature's weight, but he wasn't done yet. He kicked and swung, buying her just enough time. "Hold on, James," she whispered to herself, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. She slammed the car into gear, flooring the accelerator. The tires screeched as she sped away from the scene, heading into the night. But as she drove, her mind raced. Where were they going? What was happening to them? What had she just unleashed? The creature, the shadows, the storm that had been set in motion. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The answers felt just out of reach. But one thing was certain. She couldn't stop now. Not when James was still out there. Not when the storm was still raging. She had no choice but to face whatever was coming next. The city blurred past Eleanor as she sped through the streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Her mind raced as fast as the car, but no matter how fast she drove, she couldn't escape the image of James, struggling, fighting, and then disappearing into the shadows of the creature's grip. She hadn't looked back. She couldn't afford to. If she had, She might have lost the last ounce of strength she had left. She had to keep moving. She had to find him. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and the gnawing feeling of failure. Every part of her screamed to turn back, to go back and help him, but she knew deep down it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, wouldn't stop. Not now. It had tasted blood, and it was going to hunt her down, no matter where she went. Eleanor's breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. She kept telling herself she had made the right choice, getting out, finding safety. But every mile that stretched between her and James made her feel like she was abandoning him. The weight of that choice pressed down on her, suffocating her in the silence of the car. There was no one to talk to, no one to console her. She was alone now. But then, just as the darkness seemed to close in around her, her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She almost didn't want to look, fearing the worst, but the buzzing persisted, pulling her back to reality. She grabbed the phone and checked the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a text from James. "Get to the safe house. I'll catch up with you soon. Trust no one." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't process what she was reading. The safe house? Where was it? What was he trying to tell her? Her hands shook as she typed a quick reply, her fingers stumbling over the keys. "James? Where are you? What happened?" Seconds passed, then minutes. No response. Frustration and panic boiled over inside her. She couldn't just sit there waiting for another message, another sign. She needed answers. She needed to know where the safe house was, and what James had meant by trust no one. He had been with her every step of the way, guiding her through the darkest parts of this nightmare. But now, he was sending her cryptic messages. What was going on? The car's headlights illuminated a sign up ahead. "Welcome to Edgewater." The name sparked a memory, a place she had once heard about, but never thought she would visit. Edgewater was a small, almost forgotten town, tucked away on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense woods and old country roads. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, where everyone knew everyone else's business. She had always assumed it was just another backwater town, a place people ended up when they had nowhere else to go. But now, it felt different. Now, it felt like she was being drawn to it. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the name. Maybe it was the strange pull of fate. But something inside her told her she had to go there. The safe house. Maybe it was there. She turned onto the road leading into the town, her tires crunching on the gravel as she accelerated. The lights of the town flickered in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but the silence in the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by a strange feeling that crawled up her spine. She wasn't alone. There was something off about the atmosphere, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she scanned the road ahead, her eyes darting back and forth. There were no other cars, no signs of life. No one was out in the streets. "Where is everyone?" she whispered to herself. As she drove deeper into the town, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from James. It was a call. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the number. It was from the man in the warehouse, the one who had warned her. "Eleanor," the voice on the other end said, low and gravelly. "I told you not to get involved. Now, you've made it worse." Her pulse raced. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I'm not here to make demands," the man replied. "I'm here to give you a choice that will decide whether you live or die. The storm you've unleashed, the one that's chasing you, is about to swallow everything you care about. And you're right in the middle of it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "You're already too late," he continued, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You should have left when you had the chance. But now, you're stuck. And there's no way out. The creature? It's just the beginning. The real danger is much bigger than you think." "What are you talking about? What danger?" Eleanor's voice was rising now, panic threatening to overtake her. "You'll find out soon enough," the man said, his tone ominous. "I'll be waiting for you, Eleanor. We all will. And when the storm comes, you'll wish you'd stayed hidden." The line went dead. Eleanor stared at the phone, her mind spinning with the implications of what the man had said. The storm? What storm? She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was no closer to understanding what was happening, and the more she tried to figure it out, the more confused and terrified she became. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close. James had told her to get to the safe house. And whatever the storm was, whatever it had to do with her, she was going to face it head-on. As the town's outskirts drew closer, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than her. It was about the battle for survival, for answers, and for a truth that had been buried too long. She wasn't running anymore. The storm was coming, and Eleanor was ready to face it. The narrow streets of Edgewater twisted and turned, lined with rows of aging houses, their windows dark and empty. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made the air feel thick, like something was waiting just beneath the surface. Eleanor's eyes scanned the empty streets as she drove deeper into the town, her mind still spinning from the call she'd just received. She had no idea who the man was, or what he was talking about, but one thing was clear. The storm was far from over. The further she drove, the more she felt like something was watching her. Her instincts told her to keep moving, but her gut twisted with unease. She'd been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. The silence was oppressive, almost as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, she saw it. A small, unassuming house at the end of a cul-de-sac, tucked behind a dense row of trees. It looked like any other house in the town, faded paint, overgrown grass. But there was something about it that drew her in. She felt a strange pull, like the house was calling to her. This was it, the safe house. Eleanor parked the car at the edge of the driveway, hesitating for just a moment before she stepped out. The air felt heavy as she walked up the cracked stone path leading to the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of hope and dread swirling within her. Was James already here? Was he waiting for her? Or had the storm already found him? She reached the door and knocked. Once, twice, a third time. There was no answer. Her stomach churned with a growing sense of urgency. She tried the handle, and to her surprise, the door creaked open. It wasn't locked. "James," she called softly, stepping inside, her voice trembling. The house was dark, save for the faint light filtering through the dirty curtains. The air was thick with dust and the smell of something stale, something forgotten. She didn't want to stay here long, but she had no choice. This was where James had told her to come. She moved carefully through the house, her steps slow and cautious. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded too loud, too out of place. "James," she called again, her voice louder this time. Her heart hammered in her chest. There was no answer. As she turned the corner, something caught her eye. A small, wooden table in the hallway, with a single piece of paper resting on it. Eleanor stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for it. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink smudged and faded. She unfolded it, her breath catching as she read the few words written in jagged handwriting. "Trust no one. They are watching." Eleanor's mind raced as she looked around the room, her instinct screaming that something was horribly wrong. The storm was closing in on her, and it was far worse than she had imagined. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open behind her made her freeze. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood in the doorway, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. His face was shadowed, but his posture was stiff, controlled. He didn't speak at first, but the weight of his presence felt like a physical force pressing down on her. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. "You're not ready for this." Eleanor's pulse quickened, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, taking a step back. The man tilted his head, studying her with cold, calculating eyes. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said slowly. "What matters is that you've come to the wrong place. This isn't the safe house you think it is." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "The storm you've been running from isn't just some creature. It's much bigger than that. You've been following the wrong trail, chasing shadows while the real danger is right in front of you." Eleanor's mind reeled, but she refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, trying to steady her voice. The man gave a hollow laugh, the sound echoing in the dark room. "You should be," he said quietly. "There's nowhere left to run." Before Eleanor could react, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. She turned toward the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a figure appear in the shadows. It was James. His clothes were torn, his face bruised and bloody, but he was standing there, alive. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "James!" she cried, rushing toward him. But before she could reach him, the man stepped in her path, blocking her way. His eyes glinted with something dark, something dangerous. "You should have stayed away, Eleanor. It's too late now." Eleanor's heart pounded as she stared at the man. What was he talking about? And why was James here, looking like he had been through hell? James didn't seem surprised to see the man. In fact, he seemed resigned. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," James said quietly. "You shouldn't have come here. But now you're in it, just like the rest of us. What's going on?" Eleanor demanded, her voice cracking. "What are you talking about?" James stepped closer, his eyes full of regret. "The storm, it's not just a creature, Eleanor. It's a force, an unstoppable one. And the people you think you can trust, they're not who they seem." Eleanor's stomach dropped as she realized the truth. The man in the doorway, James's cryptic words, the warning to trust no one. It was all part of something much larger than she had ever imagined. The storm wasn't just after her. It was after everyone. And now, she was caught in the middle of it. Eleanor stood frozen in place, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The man in the doorway, the cryptic warnings from James, the strange, haunting sense that she had just walked into something far larger than herself. It was all too much. Her thoughts spiraled, trying to piece everything together. James looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't noticed before. A guarded look, as if he were holding something back, something important. He wasn't the same man she had known before. This James, this version of him, felt like a stranger. "James," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. "What is this? What's happening?" James exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for too long. He took a step toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. The man in the doorway didn't move, his cold eyes still fixed on them. Eleanor could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he were silently assessing her every move. "The storm," James began, his voice low, barely audible. "It's not just a creature. It's not even just about us. It's about everything. Everything that's been hidden, buried beneath the surface. It's been waiting for the right time." Eleanor's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. "Waiting for what? For me? For us?" James nodded slowly. "Yes. And no. You've been drawn into this because of who you are, Eleanor. The storm is after you because of what you know, or what you're supposed to know. You were never meant to find out, but somehow you did." Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What are you talking about? What do I know? I'm just an old woman. How could I possibly be involved in something like this?" The man in the doorway spoke then, his voice cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "You're not just anyone, Eleanor," he said, his voice deep, almost a growl. "You've been chosen. You've always been a part of this, even if you didn't know it. The storm has its eyes on you because it's time. Time for you to fulfill your role." Eleanor shook her head, trying to make sense of the words. "My role? I'm just a survivor. A 90-year-old woman who's lived through a lifetime of challenges, not some pawn in some cosmic game." James stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her. His touch was warm, but there was an undeniable hardness in his expression. "You've survived, Eleanor. You've lived through it all, because you have something the storm wants, something it needs." Eleanor felt her throat constrict. "What do I have that it wants?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man in the doorway leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. He didn't speak again, but the weight of his silence made Eleanor feel like she was drowning. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the very walls were closing in on her. "You have the key," James finally said, his voice almost breaking. "The key to stopping it. But you have to understand something. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about control. The storm wants to consume everything, and it will, unless you can stop it." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. "Control? What do you mean, control? What key? I don't understand, James. None of this makes any sense." The man spoke again, his tone cold and certain. "It's not supposed to make sense. Not to you. The storm's purpose is to bring everything into its fold, but it needs your help to do it. You've always been part of the plan." Eleanor took a step back, her legs shaky as her mind reeled. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to stay alive. I'm trying to make sense of this nightmare you've dragged me into, and you're telling me I have some key to stop it?" James's face twisted with emotion, but he seemed to realize just how much she was struggling. "I know this is hard to believe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But the storm, it's been here before. It's been using people, manipulating them, feeding on their fears. And now, it's coming for you because you're the only one who can stop it. The storm is ancient, but it's not indestructible. There's a way to break its hold, but it requires you, Eleanor." Eleanor looked at him, her chest tight with both anger and fear. "How do I stop it? Tell me, James. What do I need to do?" James looked down for a moment, as if steeling himself for something. "You need to face it, Eleanor. You need to confront the storm, look it in the eyes, and use the key. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to try to manipulate you, to make you doubt yourself. It's not just physical, it's psychological too. It wants to break you, but you can't let it." Her breath was coming faster now, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "And what happens if I don't?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man in the doorway spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "If you don't, it will consume everything. The storm will devour you, James, and everyone else it touches. There's no going back once you're in its grasp." Eleanor's mind spun as she processed everything James and the man had told her. The storm, the key, the manipulation. It was all too much. She wasn't prepared for this, and yet, somehow, she had been pulled into it. But there was no turning back now. James reached for her, his hand warm against her cold skin. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone, Eleanor. You never were. The storm can't break you if you stand strong." Eleanor's gaze shifted between the two men, the man in the doorway, who seemed to know everything, and James, whose face now seemed to hold a deeper sadness, as though he knew the weight of the burden she now carried. "I'll do it," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'll face it, but you have to promise me something. Promise me you'll help me, no matter what." James nodded, his eyes filled with fierce determination. "I'll be with you every step of the way." The man in the doorway didn't speak, but the faintest flicker of approval crossed his face. Eleanor felt a strange calm wash over her. This was it. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew she had to face it. The storm had come for her, and now she was going to take the fight to it. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air as Eleanor, James, and the man stood in the dimly lit hallway. Each second felt like an eternity, the silence between them pressing in like a thick fog. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, not just from the weight of the truth they had shared, but from the immense responsibility now resting on her shoulders. The storm wasn't just a physical threat. It was something far more dangerous, something ancient and terrifying. It was a force that had been lurking in the shadows for as long as anyone could remember, waiting for the right moment to rise. And now that moment was here. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. She had been running her entire life, away from fears, away from loss, away from the harsh realities that had defined her existence. But now, she had no choice. She couldn't run anymore. The storm was here, and it was coming for her, for James, for everyone she cared about. James met her gaze, his face pale but resolute. He seemed to understand the weight of the choice she was about to make. "I know it's hard, Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "but you have to trust that you're the only one who can stop this. You have to take the key and confront it. Face it head on. If you don't, everything will be lost. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure she could do it. She wasn't sure she had the strength. But there was no going back now. She had to fight. For herself. For James. For everyone who was depending on her. She turned to the man in the doorway, who had remained silent, watching them both. And you? What's your role in all of this? The man's eyes glinted with a strange mix of wisdom and sorrow. My role? He repeated, as if the question itself was almost laughable. I'm here to guide you, Eleanor. To make sure you understand what's at stake. I know the storm well. It's not something you can defeat with brute force. It's more insidious than that. It feeds on doubt, on fear. And if you let it, it will tear you apart from the inside. Eleanor swallowed hard. The idea of facing such a force, something that could break her spirit, her resolve, was almost too much to bear. But she had no other choice. If she wanted to save the people she loved, if she wanted to stop the storm, she had to face it. And she had to do it now. Without another word, she turned toward the door. The cool air of the night hit her face as she stepped outside. The world was dark, still, but the silence was deceiving. It felt as though something was stirring just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. The storm was already here. The man followed her out, his pace slow and deliberate. But James stayed behind for a moment. Eleanor paused, her hand resting on the doorknob, and looked back at him. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're sure I can do this?" James gave a small nod, his eyes filled with a quiet, unspoken emotion. "You have to. For all of us. I believe in you, Eleanor. You've always been stronger than you think." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at his words. But she didn't have time for sentiment. "Not now. I'll see you soon," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She stepped out into the night, the chill of the air biting at her skin. The man was already ahead of her, walking with a purposeful stride toward the woods on the edge of town. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then followed, her feet moving automatically, as though some invisible force was pulling her along. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches swaying in the wind like twisted hands reaching for the sky. The further they walked into the woods, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, the ground more uneven, as though the very earth itself was alive and reacting to their presence. "I hope you're ready for what's ahead," the man said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The storm doesn't just want to destroy, it wants to break you. You'll face more than just monsters and shadows. You'll face your own fears, your doubts, your regrets. And if you can't overcome them, if you let them take hold, it will consume you." Eleanor clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not afraid," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed herself. "You will be," the man replied, his voice dark with certainty. "But you must not let it control you. No matter what happens, you have to remember who you are. Don't let the storm take that from you." They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant howling of the wind. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its branches stretching upward like twisted fingers. "This is where it all begins," the man said, stopping in front of the tree. "This is where the storm's power is at its strongest. You must confront it here. Now." Eleanor stared at the tree, her heart racing. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, and she could almost feel the storm's presence closing in around her. It was waiting, watching, ready to strike. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the key, the small, weathered object that had been handed to her earlier. It felt cold in her palm, heavy with the weight of everything she had learned. She didn't know how it worked, or what she was supposed to do with it, but she knew one thing. It was her only hope. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself, though her voice faltered. The man watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "Do not fear what comes, Eleanor. Whatever happens, you must stand your ground." With that, Eleanor stepped forward, the key gripped tightly in her hand. The storm was coming, and she was going to face it head-on. The air in the clearing grew thick with tension as Eleanor stood before the ancient tree, the key in her trembling hand. The night had grown colder, and the forest around her seemed to hold its breath. A low, unsettling hum reverberated in the ground, a sound so faint, yet so powerful, it seemed to come from the very earth itself. The storm was here. Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a reminder of the weight of what she was about to face. She wasn't just battling the storm outside. She was battling the storm within, the storm of fear, regret, guilt, and doubt that had followed her entire life. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was as if the storm was reaching for her, testing her resolve. The man who had guided her stood a few paces behind, watching intently, but he didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. "Remember who you are," he had told her. But who was she? What if she wasn't strong enough? What if the storm consumed her like it had done to so many others? She gripped the key tighter, the cold metal digging into her palm. The weight of it felt heavier now, as though the world itself was pressing down on her. The darkness around her seemed to stretch, and in the distance, she could see flickers of movement, shadows darting just beyond her vision. It was coming, the storm. But Eleanor wouldn't let it win. Not this time. She had lived through too much, fought too hard to give in now. With a deep breath, she stepped closer to the tree. The key pulsed in her hand, as though it were alive, as if it knew what was coming. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, and Eleanor could hear the storm's whisper. Its voice low and insidious, like a distant memory clawing at the edges of her mind. "You're too weak," it seemed to say. "You'll never survive this. You never have." Eleanor's stomach churned, but she didn't back down. She wasn't going to let the storm take hold of her again, not after everything she had fought for. She had spent her life running, hiding, but now she was here, in the eye of the storm, and this time, she was going to fight. With shaking hands, she placed the key into the gnarled bark of the tree. There was a moment of absolute silence. The air held its breath. Then, the world exploded. The ground shook beneath her feet as a burst of light erupted from the tree, blinding and all-consuming. Eleanor staggered backward, her eyes squinting against the brilliance. The storm had found her, but now, it wasn't just the physical manifestation of the storm that attacked. It was something deeper, a force, ancient and powerful, that sought to tear at the very core of who she was. Memories, dark and painful, flashed before her eyes. She saw herself as a child, helpless, abandoned by a family that had never understood her. She saw her years in the military, facing battles that left scars on her body and soul. She saw every mistake, every regret, every moment where she had let fear hold her back. "You are nothing," the storm whispered. "You are weak. You always were." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes as the words tore through her. The storm was not just trying to destroy her physically, it was trying to break her spirit, to make her doubt everything she had fought for. It wanted her to see herself as nothing more than a collection of failures. But Eleanor would not give in. She had spent too long running from the truth of who she was. She had fought too hard to survive, and she was not going to let the storm win. "I am not afraid," she said aloud, her voice shaking but strong. "I am not weak. I am more than what you've made me believe." The storm's laughter echoed in her mind, a cruel, mocking sound that made her skin crawl. But Eleanor stood her ground, pressing the key deeper into the tree, pushing against the overwhelming force that sought to consume her. "You can't break me," she whispered fiercely, the words more for herself than for the storm. "I won't let you. Not now. Not ever." The light around her began to intensify, the storm's energy pushing against her like an ocean's tide. It was everything she had ever feared, every regret and doubt she had carried for so long, all of it crashing into her at once. But just as she thought she might crumble under the weight, something shifted. The storm faltered, just for a moment, as if confused by her resolve. Eleanor felt a sudden clarity, a surge of power, not from the key, but from within herself. This was not just about fighting the storm. It was about fighting the storm within her, the storm of self-doubt, fear, and regret that had held her captive for so long. She had spent her life letting those emotions control her, letting them dictate who she was. But not anymore. The storm recoiled, its dark tendrils retreating as Eleanor stood taller, the weight of her past, her fears, lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't the woman she had been, the scared, broken person the storm had tried to make her believe. She was stronger than that. Behind her, the man who had guided her stood in the shadows of the trees. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, betrayed a hint of pride. He had known all along that Eleanor had the strength to overcome the storm. She just needed to find it within herself. "You did it," he said, his voice soft yet filled with a quiet reverence. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes still wide with disbelief. She had done it. She had actually done it. But as she stood there, the weight of the journey she had just completed began to settle on her shoulders. She wasn't the same person who had walked into these woods hours ago. She had changed, and though the storm was gone, she knew that the journey ahead would still require strength, resolve, and wisdom. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have. Not without your help." The man gave a small smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "You've always had the strength within you, Eleanor. All I did was remind you of it. Now you know what you're capable of. You can face anything." Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to the memories the storm had unearthed, the moments of weakness, the regrets, the pain that had followed her like a shadow her entire life. She had let fear control her for so long, but no longer. The storm had not just been an external force. It had been the culmination of all the fears she had carried within herself. And now that the storm had passed, so had those fears. A deep breath filled her lungs, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt light, unburdened. The past no longer had a hold on her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm with new conviction. The man nodded. "You've always been ready, Eleanor. Now it's time to move forward, to start a new chapter. The storm may be over, but life will always throw challenges your way. The question is, how will you face them?" Eleanor thought about that for a moment. She had faced so much in her life already: loss, betrayal, pain. But it was the fear that had nearly undone her. She had spent too many years running from it. Now, she was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, with strength, and with the knowledge that she was no longer the person she once was. "I'll face them head-on," she said, her voice unwavering, "no matter what." The man stepped forward, his gaze softening. "I have no doubt." As he turned to leave, Eleanor watched him for a moment, and for the first time, she felt no need to chase after him. She had learned what she needed to know. She had learned to trust herself, to believe in her own strength. And she knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers to navigate. With a final glance at the tree, Eleanor turned away, stepping into the light of the new day. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to walk it. She was no longer running. She was moving forward, with purpose, with resolve. And though the storm had been fierce, Eleanor had come out stronger. The battle had been won, but the true victory had been the quiet strength she had found within herself. As Eleanor steps into the future, the lessons of the storm stay with her. She has learned that strength isn't just about facing the battles in front of you. It's about embracing the ones within. And with that knowledge, she is ready for whatever comes next. Thank you for joining Eleanor on her incredible journey. The storm may have passed, but her story is only just beginning. If you've learned something from her journey, if her strength inspired you, leave a comment and share where you're watching from. We all face storms in life, but it's how we face them that truly defines us. Remember, the greatest storms are often the ones we fight within ourselves. Will you find your strength when the storm comes for you?